It was the morning of May 27, 1942. Reinhard Tristan Eugen Heydrich, the acting Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, was traveling through the occupied Czech capital in an open-top car on his way to a meeting in Berlin with Hitler. As his vehicle slowed around a sharp bend, Czech resistance operatives struck. They opened fire and threw a grenade, critically wounding one of the highest-ranking and most feared officials in the Nazi regime. 8 days later, Heydrich succumbed to his injuries. Although Operation Anthropoid succeeded in ending his life, it could not erase the legacy he left behind, a legacy of corpses, mass graves, gas chambers, and some of the darkest chapters in human history. In the machinery of the Holocaust, Heydrich was a chief architect. His name is etched into the annals of atrocity in letters written with blood. To honor his achievements, Hitler renamed their scheme Operation Reinhard, the sinister project for the systematic extermination of European Jews. Under the shadow of Nazi ideology, anti-Jewish hatred was institutionalized. Over the years, restrictions and discriminatory measures were imposed on Jewish communities, eventually giving way to concentration camps and organized killings. Wherever Nazi forces marched, Jewish populations lived in constant terror, and rightly so. By the summer of 1941, the Holocaust was fully underway across occupied Europe. Einsatzgruppen units followed the Wehrmacht, orchestrating mass shootings across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Still, these massacres were insufficient for Heinrich Himmler. He and his associates believed in an industrialized solution designed to annihilate entire populations in a new, systematic way. Himmler's speeches, though often coded, left little room for misunderstanding. The Jewish question would not be solved by half measures. In July 1941, Hermann Göring issued a directive to Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Main Security Office, to draft a comprehensive plan for the so-called final solution of the Jewish question. This was not a single document or order, but an ongoing process. The first extermination camp at Chelmno began operations in late 1941, using gas vans. Early experimentation with cremation also started there. Initially, mass graves were the default disposal method, but concerns over hygiene, disease, and potential future discovery led planners to explore alternatives. As early as late 1941, experiments near Chelmno tested the viability of burning bodies in open air. These experiments later evolved into the systematic cremation of exhumed corpses. Heydrich envisioned something far larger, a network of extermination facilities designed solely for industrial-scale murder. A former SS officer, Hans Müller, later recalled, "It was clear to us that mass shootings were becoming inefficient. We needed a faster, more efficient method with as little emotional strain on the troops as possible." Himmler, Göring, and Heydrich were obsessed with mechanizing the process. Initial plans for the operation date back to October 1941, prior to the infamous Wannsee Conference. The operation's three main killing centers, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, were conceived not as labor or detention camps, but as death factories. Secrecy was paramount. On January 20, 1942, 15 men convened at a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee. High-ranking SS leaders, bureaucrats, and government officials were present not to debate the Holocaust, but to coordinate it. There were no moral questions. Heydrich, tall, cold-eyed, and ruthless, presided over the meeting, speaking with precise authority not about front lines or military strategy, but about the final solution to the Jewish question. By that winter, hundreds of thousands of Jews had already been killed with bullets in the East, leaving psychological scars on the men pulling the triggers. Heydrich sought efficiency. Genocide was bureaucratized. He stated, under proper guidance, Jews fit for labor in the East are to be allocated accordingly. Those unfit, the vast majority, will be dealt with differently, leaving no doubt about what this meant. Construction of Belzec had already begun in November 1941. Over wine and cigars, Europe's Jews were divided by country. Over 11 million people were targeted for deportation to extermination camps in occupied Poland. Although the Nazis were advancing militarily, they sought to conceal their crimes from the general population. Extermination centers were disguised as transit camps. At Treblinka, for example, train schedules matched civilian timetables. Victims were told they were being resettled, preventing resistance and maintaining the illusion until the final moment. Everyone present understood that resettlement meant death. Officials like Eichmann, Müller, Stuckert, and Frailer spoke in cold bureaucratic language, while Eichmann meticulously documented the proceedings, knowing the meeting would be historic. While debates arose over mixed marriages, half-Jews, and potential foreign resistance, none questioned the moral atrocity. The mood remained strictly professional. From that villa, the machinery of mass murder accelerated. The Holocaust became not only a campaign of hatred, but one of paperwork, signatures, charts, and schedules. Later, during his 1961 trial in Jerusalem, Eichmann reflected, "We didn't sit there beating one another's brains out. It was a language of professionals discussing a matter they had been managing for years." The coordination between Operation Reinhard and the Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, was critical. Every extermination train required careful scheduling to avoid delays on lines simultaneously used for military logistics. Engineers and civil servants adapted rail infrastructure to meet murder quotas. Their bureaucratic fingerprints were on every transport manifest, timetable, and rerouted locomotive. By late 1941, German armies were advancing deep into Soviet territory, while Himmler tirelessly developed his project. Even before the Wannsee Conference, the plan began to take shape. In October, Himmler personally appointed Odilo Blabachnik, SS and police leader of the Lublin district, to oversee industrialized extermination of Jews in occupied Polish territories. Born in Trieste and raised in post-imperial Austria, Blabachnik was a devoted Nazi long before the party seized power. Like many colleagues, he had failed academically and in business, but he displayed exactly what the Nazi regime valued most: loyalty, cruelty, and ideological zeal. By 1939, his prominence in the party had grown, and in Lublin he supervised mass deportations, ghettoization, and early experiments in systematic murder. Blabachnik was not chosen arbitrarily. He showed brutal efficiency and also managed to overcome bureaucratic problems with ease. Ideal for secret missions. Moral dilemmas were never a problem for him. From that moment, the ghettoization and deportation policy changed to total extermination. The final solution was in full swing. Blabachnik, who operated from his office in Lublin Castle, soon created a circle of trusted men to accomplish their mission. Many of them also participated in the T4 euthanasia program, an operation that provided the Nazis with experience for a much larger scale operation. The T4 program officially stopped because of the public response in Germany. So they learned it had to be conducted in secrecy. Also, the T4 program helped establish that circle of brutal killers whom Blabachnik needed. These men like Christian V., Franz Stangl, and Friedrich Abel were perfect applicants, ideologically convicted without any remorse, experienced gas chamber murderers. The only difference was that instead of mentally ill and disabled Germans, the victims were to be European Jews, all of them. During the meeting with his inner circle, Blabachnik once again spoke about the secrecy and the cold professionalism needed in achieving this dreadful task. This is one of the most highly secret matters there are, perhaps the most secret. Anybody who speaks about it is shot dead immediately. 2 talkative people died yesterday. Franz Stangl was a police officer who joined the Nazi regime after the Annales in 1938. He also participated in the T4 euthanasia program where he supervised the mass killing. He was a skilled administrator but also followed any orders without hesitation. Ambitious as he was, Stangl knew it was the best possible way to prosper far in Hitler's Germany. Interestingly, his moral dilemmas started only when he was painfully aware of losing the war and the consequences of his actions that were about to follow. Stangl wasn't a natural-born killer. He was a manager, and an administrator of death. He industrialized death with cold professionalism. And that's how he became close to Odilo Blabachnik and Christian Wirth. And Christian Wirth was something else, even in Strangl's eyes. During one of the interviews before his death, Strangl recalled also defending himself. To tell the truth, one did become used to it. They were cargo. I think it started the day I first saw the Totenlager extermination area in Treblinka. I remember Ver standing there next to the pits full of black-blue corpses. It had nothing to do with humanity. It could not have. It was a mass of rotting flesh. Worth said, "What shall we do with this garbage?" I think unconsciously that started me thinking of them as cargo. Also a policeman before becoming a war criminal, Christian Ver was over a decade older than the others from the inner circle. He was a detective who praised discipline and obedience above everything else. He believed in the law. And in his eyes the law was Adolf Hitler. Also a veteran of the T4 program. He was chosen because he always followed procedure. Although he wasn't always doing everything industrially, he enjoyed cruelty. He was the one ready to kill on command and help others get better at that. Under Globnik's directive, Ver began organizing training facilities for future camps personnel. Also, Ver was one of the most important figures in designing gas chambers in killing centers. With these people who formed the inner circle, Heydrich and Globnik had rounded up the team ready to conduct the operation. The next task was to find suitable locations and people who were willing to work in these places. The logistical preparation proceeded with equal urgency. Foundations of genocide, Poland's role in Operation Reinhard and the rise of the death camps. Poland lost its independence to Nazi Germany in the first month of the war, and soon it became a foundation ground for all the grandiose Nazi plans for Europe. First, the Poles needed to be relocated to create enough living space for Germans. But an even more urgent question was the wiping out of the Jews. Poland was near Germany, in the very heart of Nazi-occupied Europe, connected by railway to all the places where there was a large Jewish population in Europe. With that agreed, they needed the actual locations for the camps. Belzec and Treblinka were not randomly chosen. Each location sat near existing railway lines, but away from large urban centers, providing both accessibility and secrecy. Belzec was the first camp to become operational. Located conveniently along the Lublin-Lviv rail line, construction began in November 1941 under Worth's supervision. The region's isolation was seen as ideal for its purpose. The camp could be built, operated, and emptied without arousing too much attention from the local population or any of the resistance groups. Also, the camp location showed the Nazi administrative efficiency and also foresaw a dark future for Jewish people living in already terrible conditions in ghettos near the camp area. These ghettos were the first ones targeted for liquidation, and for Belzec, its new population was to be gathered from Lublin, Lviv, and Warsaw. So, at least in the beginning, there was no need for long transport, and a steady flow of victims was assured. And while these locations were prepared for future victims, at the same time, Globnik also initiated the construction of another type of buildings connected to the liquidation of ghettos. These huge warehouses were to be used as sorting stations and storage centers for looted goods. Further evidence that the future Operation Reinhard was as much an exercise in robbery as it was in genocide. With most of the ideas being decided, it was also very important to find people ready to work in these camps. Since the mass executions took a significant psychological toll on the German soldiers who carried out these murders, it was essential to reduce the number of needed personnel to keep the death camps running and continue with the genocide. Also, these people had to be ready to work there, which can also show their character and their willingness to participate in these executions. The recruitment of personnel followed the chillingly systematic logic. Globnik authorized the creation of a mobile bureaucracy of death. Clerks, drivers, construction workers and guards were drawn from across the Reich and occupied Europe. There were different reasons why these people decided to join the Nazi death machine. Some of them were ideologues who firmly believed in the cause, while others were opportunists who wanted to exploit the situation for their personal benefit. They were all bound by the oath of secrecy and the promise of reward. The secrecy was integral, and the SS even established cover units like SSS Commando Belzec to maintain the illusion that these camps were transit centers or labor deployment points. For outsiders, these installations appeared genuine. Another part of the vast machinery of German occupation and logistics for further conquests, and these people needed to be trained. There the efficiency took over once again. Treblinka was a quiet village in the Lublin district of occupied Poland, also close to the railway lines. In 1941, under the direction of Glonek, it became something else. A former sugar factory was repurposed into a training camp, not for soldiers, but for collaborators, mostly from Ukraine. These men trained by the SS became the most brutal camp guards, later known as the Treblinka men. Jor Labink, a former Soviet P trained at Treblinka in 1941, recalled the brutal training methods. "We were trained in the rules for guarding and escorting prisoners. The Germans beat into our heads that we were not to give the slightest quarter while guarding and escorting prisoners. We were not to have the slightest contact with prisoners. We were not to give them any water or food. And for the slightest infractions, we were to shoot them without any warning. Their job was to guard ghettos, hunt down Jews, and operate the extermination camps." Ukrainian guards were mostly volunteers. They became the hands that carried out mass shootings, herded victims into gas chambers, and crushed uprisings. Treblinka was a factory of killers, ready to supply the death factories that followed. These guards maintained order, prevented escape, and enforced the routines, but also showed their sadistic nature. One of them was Fodor Fedorino, who served for a year in Treblinka as a non-commissioned officer. He led a group that was involved in shaving, stripping, beating, and leading victims to the gas chambers. Some sources state that he very much loved his job. Everything was ready for annihilation, and the places were to be set for running and completing their sinister purpose. Belzec, where death took shape. By early December 1941, with the Soviet counteroffensive beginning around Moscow, the Nazi leadership understood that a swift victory in the East was no longer guaranteed. So it was even more important to expand the operation of annihilation. For men like Globoknik and Wirth, this was a parallel front in the war, a war against what they believed was the internal enemy, even more important than the one against the enemies from the outside. In that background, SS engineers and construction crews worked under absolute secrecy to prepare the infrastructure for mass murder. Unlike Auschwitz, where forced labor and extermination were fused into a hybrid model, the Reinhard camps were death factories in the purest sense. The Nazis' plans, although secret, were not hidden in a regular manner. They were hidden in plain sight, crafted to blend into the rural Polish landscape, concealed by dense forests and miles of desolation. The first of these, Belzec, was established near the Lublin district and quickly became a model for others. The blueprint for the extermination centers was deceptively simple and designed by Christian Wirth. And it all started with Belzec. In the chill of early November 1941, in the village of Belzec, the construction began. The village was remote enough to escape any suspicion, yet close enough to the Jewish populations of the Lublin and Galicia districts for rapid deportation. SS Oberstführer Richard Tamila, a civil engineer and a member of Odilo Globoknik's inner circle, got the task of overseeing the building of the camp. The work itself began with the clearing of a wooded area that had previously been used as a forced labor camp. Anti-tank ditches dug by the Soviets during their occupation of the region were still present and would soon be repurposed as mass graves. Everything was used by the Germans in their almost dogmatic efficiency. Local Polish laborers were hired at first to lay the foundations and erect fencing, but their presence was temporary. As the camp infrastructure took shape, they were replaced by Jewish slave laborers, brought in from nearby ghettos under heavy guard. In the awful twist of fate, they were brought to the construction site to prepare the place for their deaths. One of the survivors later recalled, "We were under the illusion that we were building a labor camp, but then we saw the pipes, the chambers. We knew there was nothing to be done. Death was already part of the bricks." The camp was divided into two main zones, the reception area and the extermination area. Victims would arrive at the reception sector, stepping off cargo trains into what looked like a standard transit camp. There they were told to undress for cleaning. All of their possessions were confiscated. Ukrainian guards whose cruelty would become infamous oversaw the brutal process. On the other part, concealed behind tall wooden fences, was the extermination zone. There, hidden from view, the first gas chambers were built. These were wooden structures insulated with sand and lined with zinc sheeting. These chambers pumped carbon monoxide into the rooms. Each chamber was divided into 3 parts to accommodate more victims at once. Ironically, they used converted Soviet tank engines as gas generators. These were robust, portable, and could produce the deadly concentrations of carbon monoxide needed to kill large numbers of people in sealed chambers. But even these early gas chambers were not enough for the scale of murder envisioned by Globoknik. In the spring of 1942, the wooden building was demolished and it was replaced by a much larger structure of brick and concrete. Here there were 6 gas chambers. The new facility could kill thousands in a single day. Guard towers were erected at the corners of the camp and barbed wire fences enclosed the grounds. The entire site was camouflaged with trees, earthworks, and false signage. German SS men, including Christian Wirth himself, arrived to supervise the final stages. According to later testimonies, he oversaw every detail, even the type of brick used in the gas chamber walls. Still, there were some setbacks, and the construction of the camp was slowed by the bitter winter of 1941 to 1942. Blizzards swept through the region and temperatures went to -25 degrees C. Even so, the work never stopped. Forced laborers died of exposure, exhaustion, and abuse. By March 1942, Belzec was ready. The first transports of Jews arrived from the Lublin ghetto and surrounding towns. The average lifespan of an arriving Jew was measured in hours. By the end, only 2 are known to have survived. In a matter of a few months, a quiet village in Poland became the prototype for industrial genocide. But Belzec wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And the lessons learned there would be applied to even deadlier killing centers like Sobibor and Treblinka. The industrialization of death, the rise of Sobibor and Treblinka. As the first death camp at Belzec continued fulfilling its purpose, Reinhard Heydrich, Odilo, Globoknik, and the others wanted to win their conflict against the whole Jewish nation as soon as possible. And the next site in line for mass murders was Sobibor. Sur similarly, was constructed through forced labor. Its location chosen for its proximity to major railway lines. It is obvious that the Germans didn't want to change the efficient system that worked. Sur's design took this brutal efficiency even further with the use of electric fences and a highly organized rail network that allowed for the swift unloading of victims. Unlike Belzec, Sur used a more complex layout with multiple gas chambers to accommodate larger groups. The train tracks ran straight to the reception area where Jews were told they would be resettled. Instead, within hours or sometimes minutes, they were gassed. The gas chambers at Sobibor were built underground, creating an added sense of claustrophobia for those who entered. oblivious to their fate. Within months of its opening in 1942, Sobibor's death toll had reached tens of thousands, a staggering number that mirrored the efficiency of the other death camps. 1. Survivor of Sobibor, Thomas Blatt, later recalled, "We walked past flowers. I still remember the flowers. They were planted outside the building with the gas chambers as if death needed decoration. So opened in May and Treblinka followed in July. It was the most notorious of the three, ending the lives of the largest number of people in Treblinka was a synonym for death. The camp would eventually surpass both Belzec and Sobibor in terms of victim numbers as it served as a central hub in the Nazis' extermination machine. Treblinka's location near the Warsaw Ghetto ensured a steady stream of victims. The camp's killing process was horrifyingly quick, designed to process an unimaginable number of human beings each day. Unlike the other camps, Treblinka's leadership believed in complete annihilation. The bodies were burned in huge pits, a grotesque testament to the scale of the operation. Franz Stangl, who became the camp commandant, later admitted in interrogation, "My conscience is clear. I was only the camp commandant. I never killed anyone. I was just responsible for transport and organization. My job was to keep things moving." At Treblinka, diesel engines were used to generate lethal carbon monoxide, which filled the gas chambers. SS officer Kurt Franz boasted that once a transport arrived, the camp could process thousands of people in under 2 hours. Still, they wanted to maintain secrecy. For example, the village of Treblinka saw its modest siding upgraded to accommodate trains carrying thousands of deportees per day. The Nazis constructed false train stations at Treblinka, complete with fake Timmets and Red Cross symbols. The aim was speed, silence, and total erasure. Between July and September 1942 alone, over 265,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto were sent to Treblinka and murdered. Survivor Richard Glazer, who was among a small group that managed to escape, recalled, "We were told we were going to Ukraine to work, but I saw the ashes in the air. We all did." The camp was swallowing lives every day. As the infrastructure of these two camps took shape, it became clear that Soir and Treblinka would mark a terrifying evolution. They were not camps in the traditional sense. There were no barracks for survival and no long-term plans for labor. When some unlucky souls entered these camps, the sole purpose was easily discovered. They were built to exterminate. Over time, as the number of victims grew, the camps adapted, often expanding or redesigning certain aspects to ensure a smoother operation. At Sobibor, for example, the gas chambers were rebuilt after the initial structures proved insufficient. Similarly, Treblinka was constantly upgraded to accommodate the ever-increasing flow of victims. At both sites, the SS worked closely with a small group of Treniki trained guards and Jewish prisoners known as Sonderkommandos who were forced to participate in the killing process. Their fate was sealed from the beginning. Survivor Thomas Blatt, who later escaped from Sobibor, wrote decades later, "You did not live at Sobibor. You arrived and you died. Those of us selected to work were not saved. We were simply delayed." These camps were the result of logistical optimization. The Nazis streamlined gassing procedures and learned from failures at earlier sites. The expansion to Sobibor and Treblinka marked the apex of Operation Reinhardt's brutality, a calculated transformation of murder into industry. The machinery of death inside the killing factories of Sobibor, Treblinka, and Belzec. "We didn't understand anything," they told us, "to undress, to leave our clothes in order, and we believed them. I saw mothers covering their children's eyes. Nobody screamed. We were all numb." Survivor Ada Littman remembers the arrival. She was among the very few chosen for forced labor. She cleaned the belongings of the murdered The rest were sent straight to the gas chambers. What still terrifies the most, even after 8 decades, is the precision of how the Germans conducted the murders. As this survivor testified, upon arrival at the death camps, prisoners were subjected to a swift and unforgiving selection process that sealed their fate. Within minutes, when the trains arrived, their doors were thrown open, and frightened masses were forced to come out. Many were too weak to stand after the horrific journey. Women, children, the elderly, and the visibly ill were separated and sent away. Most would never return. Treblinka's process was similarly brutal and deceptive. Camp survivor Samuel Willenberg, one of the few to escape Treblinka, recalled the arrival process. "We were forced to undress. The Germans told us it was for disinfection. My father refused to believe it was a death camp. But I saw it in the eyes of the SS. They had no reason to lie. We were meant to die." The selection process, although brutal, was just the first step in the system's larger machinery. Within hours of their arrival, victims were stripped of all possessions, including clothing and shoes, and marched into the so-called showers. These chambers were equipped to kill hundreds of people at once. Once the doors were sealed, the SS guards would release Cyclone B, a pesticide that had been repurposed for mass murder. The gas, when inhaled, caused suffocation, and within minutes, the victims would be dead. A rare testimony from Rudolf Red, one of only 2 known survivors of Belzec, captures the terror of what followed. They screamed and beat people. The chambers were filled with 1,000 people. When the door was shut, they turned on the motor. I was assigned to remove the bodies. I saw what the gas did. Their faces, their twisted limbs. I can never forget. The scale of killing demanded gruesome efficiency. The bodies were pulled from the chambers, their gold teeth removed, their hair shorn, and then carried to massive cremation pits or furnaces. In Treblinka, the volume became so overwhelming that open-air purs were constructed. The ashes of tens of thousands were crushed and scattered to hide all evidence. One aspect of the internal organization of the camps was the division of labor among different SS units, which helped ensure the continuity of the extermination process. These included the SS Totenkopfverbände, Death's Head units, which oversaw the daily operations of the camps, including guarding the prisoners and managing the logistics of the mass killings. Special Einsatzgruppen units were responsible for the mobile killing operations, while the gas chambers, crematoria, and various other methods of extermination were administered by SS and civilian staff. Within the camps, the brutal hierarchy of the Nazi camp system was designed to dehumanize both the prisoners and the personnel who carried out the work, cultivating an environment where mass murder became institutionalized, systematic, and disturbingly efficient. Franz Sockel, an SS officer at Treblinka, later gave a chilling post-war confession. "It was all so normal. We had orders and we followed them. There was a plan for everything. How many to kill, when to burn the bodies, how to clean the chambers. It was like a factory." The camps of Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor were built not for imprisonment but for elimination. Unlike Avets, which had a hybrid function, these facilities existed solely to exterminate, no large barracks, and no extensive work detail. There was only arrival, deception, death, and disposal. Similar to the 2 bigger camps at Belzec, victims were processed through an intake area where they were forced to undress before being directed to the gas chambers. These chambers were hidden behind the facade of a shower room to maintain the order. In reality, the showers were sealed airtight and the victims suffocated to death within minutes of the doors being closed. The corpses were then removed by Jewish prisoners, often forced into the monstrous task of disposing of the bodies. One such Sando member Remembered, they made us drag out the bodies, the eyes of the dead still open, their mouths twisted. We had no names. Only numbers. We had no strength, only fear. Testimony of Kame Hersman, the other Belzec survivor. 1945, after the killings, bodies were dumped into mass graves and later exhumed and burned in large open-air PS. This effort, known as Stir Action 1005, was aimed at removing all physical evidence. A Polish railway worker, Franciscan Becky, who witnessed the constant flow of trains to Treblinka, later testified, the smell. The smoke, it never stopped. We knew what was happening. We just couldn't speak of it. The operation was in full swing, but in 1942, it had to change its name, and the reason for it was very problematic for Germans. Revenge and retribution, the assassination of Heydrich, and the hellish price of resistance. Despite the immense secrecy, news of the exterminations began to spread. Underground reports reached the Polish resistance and were smuggled out to the west. However, few could grasp the scale or the truth. In the meantime, the machinery of death kept running. Still, one name became the most associated with the Nazi brutality and mass murders: Reinhard Heydrich. This provoked the Czech government in exile in London and decided to eliminate the most important Nazi figure in Prague. It was a carefully planned action, months in the making and executed with nerves of steel. In late 1941, the British Special Operations Executive and the Czechoslovak government authorized the assassination of the Butcher of Prague. Operation Anthropoid was to be completed by two young Czechoslovak paratroopers trained in Britain, Josef Gavšík and Jan Kubas. They parachuted into occupied Czechoslovakia in December 1941 and spent months in hiding, planning, gathering intelligence, and awaiting the right moment. As stated in the beginning, on the morning of May 27, 1942, Heydrich, known for his arrogance and a sense of invincibility, rode in his open-top Mercedes without an escort, as he did every day. Gabsch took the opportunity and raised his gun, but it jammed. Without hesitation, Kubas threw a modified anti-tank grenade. It exploded beside the car, sending shrapnel deep into Heydrich's body. Heydrich emerged from the car, pistol drawn, trying to pursue his attackers before collapsing. At first, he seemed to recover, but within days, infection from the shrapnel set in. On June 4, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died in a Prague hospital. One of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany had been struck down in broad daylight. A symbolic and strategic blow to the Nazi regime. After Heydrich's assassination in June 1942 by the Czechoslovak resistance, the operation that embodied his genocidal vision was renamed in his honor. Soon the Rebellion began. Adolf Hitler personally attended the funeral procession, although in private conversations was very angry at Heydrich. Such heroic gestures as driving in an open unarmored vehicle or walking about the streets unguarded are just damned stupidity which serves the fatherland not one whit. That a man as irreplaceable as Heydrich should expose himself to unnecessary danger I can only condemn as stupid and idiotic. Still, the Nazi leadership demanded an immediate and ruthless reprisal. Adolf Hitler in a fit of rage ordered what he called a lightning-fast retaliation so terrifying that no one will dare lift a finger against the Reich again. Heinrich Himmler personally oversaw the operation. Within days, hundreds were arrested. Interrogations were brutal and swift. Those suspected, often without evidence, were executed or disappeared into concentration camps. 2 villages were mentioned during these interrogations, and that sealed the fate of their population. The small Czech village of Lidich became the most infamous symbol of Nazi reprisals following Heydrich's death. On June 10, 1942, the SS stormed Lidich. Every male in the village over the age of 15 was executed on the spot, while the women and children were either sent to concentration camps or murdered as well. The homes of the villagers were set on fire and the village itself was destroyed. In the end, 173 men and teenage boys were marched to the Horak family farm and executed by firing squad in groups of 10. One survivor, Marie Sapova, who was a child in Lidic at the time, remembered, "They told us we would go to a better place, to a German school. I never saw my mother again. I later found out she died in Ravensbrück. I was just a little girl. I didn't understand why it happened." Just 2 weeks later, the other village, Lazaki, met a similar fate. Resistance members had hidden a radio transmitter used to communicate with London in the village. That was enough. On June 24, 1942, the Gestapo arrived. Every adult was executed or deported. All children were taken, some for forced labor, others to their deaths. Lazaki was wiped off the map. One of the few survivors of Lazaki, a girl who was only 7 years old, later testified, "They said we would be re-educated. My sister never came back. I remember the black uniformed men, their dogs, and the fear on my mother's face. She held my hand so tightly before they tore us apart." The SS hunted down anyone even remotely connected to the operation. Over 5,000 Czechs were arrested in the ensuing crackdown. Among them was Father Vladimir Petrich of the Orthodox Church in Prague, who had helped hide the parachutists in the crypt of St. Cyril and Methodius Cathedral. He and others were tortured for weeks. A surviving fellow priest later wrote, "They broke his fingers, crushed his ribs, but he never spoke. His silence protected the others. He knew what it meant. He chose death." The final showdown came in that very cathedral. After weeks of hunting, the Gestapo discovered the hiding place of the assassins. On June 18, 1942, more than 750 SS troops stormed the church. Gabshik Kubis and their comrades held them off for hours in a fierce gun battle. When they ran out of ammunition, they chose death over capture. A Czech bystander, Joseph Kula, recalled what he saw from the street. There was smoke pouring from the crypt windows, and you could hear shouting in German. The church shook with every explosion. We didn't know who was inside, but we knew they were heroes. The architect of the Holocaust was no more, and the Germans went to a great extent to hunt down his killers. Many innocents perished during the hunt, while many others ended up in the camps Heydrich helped to be found. He was gone, but the operation continued now as Operation Reinhard. Extermination unleashed, the final phase of Operation Reinhard. Although its mastermind was gone, Operation Reinhard had shifted into full gear in the middle of 1942. The months between the summer and fall of 1942 were the most coordinated and ruthless stages of this operation. In cities such as Warsaw, Lublin, and Radom, Jewish communities were torn apart. Ghettos were systematically emptied, with the inhabitants sent to labor camps, death camps, or subjected to mass executions. In Warsaw, where close to 300,000 Jews were deported to Treblinka in just over 2 months, survivors of this hell on earth remember the chaos like it was yesterday. Cain Goldstein, who managed to escape during the Great Deportation, later wrote, "We were driven like animals to the Umschlagplatz, mothers clutching babies, old men trembling, children crying. I saw a man shot for bending to pick up his mother's scarf. There was no mercy, only orders, shouting, and death." These deportations were intentionally designed to break the spirits of those involved and to dehumanize them in every possible way. Jews were herded onto trains like cattle, packed together in cramped conditions that allowed no room for movement, air, or escape. Some survivors later recalled that the trains were so overcrowded that people suffocated long before reaching their destinations. The hopelessness inside those carriages was almost touchable as people realized the full extent of the nightmare they were enduring. The trains became the final bridge between life and extermination. Cramped and airless, the deportation wagons quickly turned into coffins. Ruth Elias, deported from the Teresian ghetto to Auschwitz, remembered, there was no water, no light, no place to sit. We stood pressed against each other like sardines. The stench was unbearable. We did not know where we were going, but we knew it was not anywhere good. People collapse from lack of air. I remember thinking, this is how animals are treated, not people. For the SS men and their collaborators, deportations were viewed not as crimes, but as tasks to complete. They herded us into the wagons. We were screaming. Children were screaming, but they did not flinch. To them, we were no longer human. We were just numbers, freight to be sent away. I saw a child trampled underfoot and no one stopped. The train doors shut and we knew this was the end. In Lublin, a city once home to a large Jewish community, the deportations were carried out with military precision under the watchful eye of Odilo Globoknik. The victims were taken to the infamous Maidan concentration camp where many were gassed or shot upon arrival. This was the same fate that awaited those transported to Treblinka, Sur, and Belzec. One survivor, Leon Feldhandler, who would later become a key figure in the Sobibor uprising, described the atmosphere. The SS didn't look at us. They just shouted and pushed. In Maidan, there was no pretending. You arrived and you saw the smoke. You smelled the burning. If you asked questions, you were beaten. We quickly learned silence was survival. This pattern repeated across the killing centers of Treblinka, Sur, and Belzec. In Treblinka, the vast majority never saw anything but the unloading ramp and the gas chambers. Chil Rachman, who escaped Treblinka and later testified, recalled, they pushed us with rifle butts. There was a sign, bath and disinfection, but there was no water, only gas. You could hear the screams. You could smell the bodies. The chambers were packed so tightly that people died even before the gas was released. We had to drag out the corpses and burn them. Even those who survived the deportation journeys were not spared suffering. They ended up in temporary camps or work barracks, often starving, just waiting for death. The mental scars ran deeper than the physical ones. And for the ones committing the murders, it was just a job. A Ukrainian guard at Sobibor, Ivan Demyanyuk, would later be accused in Israel of participating in these killings. During his trial, testimony by a fellow guard described the normalization of horror. He did what the others did. We all did. You stopped seeing people after a while. You only saw lines. Lines of bodies. Oddly enough, the person charged as Demyanyuk managed to be released by the Israeli Supreme Court as there was no evidence to confirm he actually was Demyanyuk or Ivan the Terrible. In addition, Ivan the Terrible was something else. For others, it was just a job, but not for him. For instance, survivor Penis Epstein recounted witnessing Ivan beat prisoners to death with a lead pipe and operate the diesel engine that pumped lethal gas into the chambers as a volunteer. Yet, in some ghettos, small-scale uprisings and resistance efforts delayed the deportations due to individuals who attempted to fight back. In the Warsaw Ghetto, the final uprising in April 1943 was one such act of resistance, though it ended in tragedy as the remaining Jews of the ghetto fought a doomed battle against the Nazi forces. By then an industrial kill machine of murder had been perfected. At this point, the SS was no longer experimenting. It was executing in every sense of the word. The human suffering that surged through Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka in those months has no equal in modern history. Though cracks would soon appear in the Nazi plan for millions, it was already too late. The silent witnesses, the destruction of the extermination camps. By the late autumn of 1943, Operation Reinhard was approaching its end. With the extermination of nearly 2 million Jews across Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, and with Soviet forces advancing from the east, the Nazi regime shifted its focus from mass murder to the equally calculated erasure of its crimes. What followed was not the end of violence, but an equally methodical operation to destroy all physical traces of the extermination machine. In 1943, facing increasing resistance and fearing Soviet advances, the Sobibor and Treblinka camps were ordered to be dismantled. Nearly 250,000 people were murdered at Sobibor, and over 700,000 at Treblinka, making it the second deadliest Nazi extermination camp after Auschwitz. As the retreating Germans tried to destroy the evidence, survivors became living proof of what had occurred. In a report after the war, Camp Escape and Resistance member Richard Glazer recounted, "Everything was organized to erase the crime. They told us to rake the ashes, grind the bones, and spread them in the forest. They wanted to wipe out every trace. The order came from the top." Heinrich Himmler, fully aware of the war's shifting momentum, visited Sobibor and later Treblinka in the summer and autumn of 1943. His directive was clear: dismantle everything, cremate the corpses, level the buildings, and leave no trace of the industrial slaughter that had unfolded. It was a systematic cover-up, cloaked in euphemisms like special treatment and final clearance. Under Action 1005, a campaign already underway at other mass killing sites, the SS began exhuming tens of thousands of decomposing bodies buried in mass graves and burning them atop makeshift PS constructed from railroad ties and soaked in gasoline. The secrecy surrounding the camps was also an essential element of the operation. As the genocide continued, the Nazis took extensive measures to conceal the scale of the extermination efforts. Evidence was systematically destroyed. Documents were burned. Crematoria were expanded and survivors were often murdered to prevent them from testifying. Some of the prisoners in Sobibor realized the only chance was to escape. In the Sobibor uprising of October 1943, they broke through the fences under a hail of gunfire. One of them, Thomas Blatt, who later wrote his memoirs, remembered the final moments before the revolt. "We knew we would die anyway. Better to die with a weapon than in the gas. We ran. I heard gunshots. I didn't look back." At Treblinka, the work had already begun months earlier. Under the command of SAS officers Kurt Franz and Christian Wirth, Jewish slave laborers were forced to exhume and burn the corpses. Fires burned day and night. One Polish railway worker passing near the camp later recalled the thick black smoke that lingered in the sky for weeks and the stench that clung to everything. Jankiel Viennik, a survivor of Treblinka, who later escaped during the August 1943 uprising, wrote in his memoir, "A year in Treblinka, the purse were as tall as a man. We stacked the corpses, one layer after another, with wood between them. Then the fire would be lit. The smell was unbearable, and the flames reached the sky. We worked like this every day, surrounded by guards and barking dogs. We were told, when you finish, you die." The Nazis were deeply concerned with maintaining the illusion of the clean war in the East, even as they were committing genocide. Every concrete foundation, every gas chamber, every personal item looted from victims had to vanish. At Belzec, nearly the entire camp was demolished. The ground was leveled and the remaining structures were demolished. The site was covered with a thin layer of soil and planted with fir trees and lupins to disguise the terrain. A Ukrainian guard and several locals were assigned to pose as farmers, cultivating the fake field over mass graves, masking the horror with agriculture. A local Polish farmer from the region interviewed decades later during the post-war investigations remembered walking past the site It was quiet. There, just trees and wild flowers. But we knew the earth wasn't right. When the rain came, sometimes the ground would shift and bones would surface. The forest tried to hide it, but the truth was always there. At Sobibor, the demolition effort coincided with the already mentioned uprising on October 14, 1943. About 300 prisoners managed to escape, of which around 50 survived the war. This revolt fastened up the dismantling process. Within weeks, the gas chambers were destroyed, barbed wire fences taken down, and buildings dismantled piece by piece. The Nazis even rerouted the nearby railway lines to erase any evidence of a transportation hub. Soviet investigators, who arrived months later, found only disturbed earth and shallow human remains, clear signs of hurried concealment, but little else. The destruction was also not without bureaucratic precision. Jewish prisoners, many of them survivors of earlier deportations to Treblinka and Sobibor, were retained at all three sites for these final tasks. At Belzec, the last 30 prisoners were marched into the woods and shot. Documents related to the killings were also destroyed in great quantities. Train manifests, deportation lists, construction blueprints, and everything that could tie Operation Reinhardt's infrastructure to its purpose was systematically eliminated, yet some records endured. The hopeful telegram, intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, documented the number of Jews deported to each camp, providing proof that the killings were not only orchestrated but meticulously recorded. These fragments, combined with eyewitness testimonies and forensic evidence, would later form the foundation for post-war trials and historical reconstruction. The SS leadership believed their efforts would remain hidden. The camps were meant to vanish into the Polish landscape, and the millions murdered were intended to be rendered invisible. Yet the earth remembered. In the years following the war, investigations uncovered remnants, bones, bullets, children's toys, jewelry, and dentures. These were not mere artifacts, but silent witnesses, irrefutable in their testimony. For the few who managed to survive and escape, the horrors they witnessed were nearly impossible to comprehend or convey to the outside world. The survivors, often scarred both physically and psychologically for life, became among the few to reveal the full scope of the atrocities committed within these extermination centers. Their voices are some of the very few that remain. As survivor Samuel Willenberg, the last living witness of Treblinka before his death in 2016, reflected, "I carry the camp with me. I see it every night. We cannot let it be forgotten." The systematic killing operation of Operation Reinhard represented the most intense phase of the Holocaust, claiming over 1.7 million lives in less than 2 years. Every stage of the process, from the train ramps to the gas chambers, was executed with chilling precision, masking death behind bureaucracy, deception, and mechanical routine. The camps functioned under a strict veil of secrecy. Yet the testimonies of those who survived pierced that silence, offering a haunting glimpse into the cold, calculated machinery of the Nazi genocide.